Hi, Alexis. This is Ira. I'm recording here my audio feedback on your statement of belief. As I've mentioned in class, the aim of this feedback isn't to provide critique per se of the statement of belief itself, but rather to help you think about questions that may be useful as you move from that statement of belief to your more rigorously developed theory of good argument, i.e. the Defining Good Argument in Digital Contexts paper. So essentially what I'll do is I'll walk through the paper, and as I'm doing so, offer some comments and mostly questions or things that I'd be interested to hear you talk more about as you move forward. Okay, so you describe an argument as a main idea or a claim or a thesis statement. So this is one way of thinking about what an argument is, i.e. it's the particular assertion with which reasonable people might disagree that runs through a given piece of argumentative discourse. There are other moments in the paper where it seems like you're talking more about argument as the overarching argument, i.e. like a piece of discourse that a person produces that functions argumentatively on the whole, but this is the starting position here. So when you say that a good argument is either valid or strong, I'm interested in what you see as the difference between validity and strength in argument, and which you think matters more and why. So are these equally important? Are they the same thing? I mean, I think we can probably say they're not the same thing, both because that's how you wrote it, but also because certainly there are arguments that people find engaging without those arguments necessarily being valid in a strong logical sense. But I'd like to hear more about what you see as the relationship between validity and strength and argument, and what you see, how you see that relationship being defined in terms of what arguments are for and why we make arguments. And as you move forward, and this kind of comes up throughout the statement of belief in general, I'd be interested to hear you say more about what you think of as logic. What is logic? What makes some premises logical, properly so called, and others not? So what is it, in other words, that makes this portion of both here and as you go on further of your definition of good argument important, and how does it function or operate? Now you talk about the impossibility of avoiding bias, which I think is, a good point. That is, at the end of the day, what argument is disagreement, and disagreement is a form of bias. And at the same time, you suggest that we want to at least be minimally biased in argument. And you make the distinction between our emotions, which drive what we feel like is right and wrong, and urge arguers to eschew or avoid emotional argument and instead rely solely on reasons backed by scholarly evidence. Here I find myself wondering, okay, but why? What is argument for that would be good? Certainly there are times when argument that's not relying on reasons backed by scholarly evidence is much more persuasive than argument that is relying on reasons backed by scholarly evidence. But either way, even beyond that, why solely? What's the value, in other words, of trying to have an argument be emotionless? What's the point of that? And so that's some of that gets back to what argument is for. And you talk a little bit about that here when you say that you want to show the audience that you've seriously considered many sides of an issue, and you're not simply attacking your opponents. You're showing that your arguments are better than the opponents. And this is a very kind of debate mode here. And I think that's fair enough. But what about all the places where there isn't really a debate, whether it's an advertisement or a politician's speech? So these are instances of arguments that don't really have a direct interlocutor. There isn't really necessarily a direct opponent. There might be, but there isn't necessarily. So how does good argument relate to audience, and why? And I keep coming back to the why because I want to see how you pull these different things together. Right now, and this is fine for the statement of belief, by the way, but I'm just thinking forward from here to the more systematic definition of good argument in digital contexts. Right now, you have kind of a lot of different pieces. And I think they're all kind of, certainly for me, they're all plausible. Some of them you argue for more fully or explain or elaborate on more fully. But they're not necessarily super clearly tied together. So here, for instance, you say, making an argument, expressing a point of view on a subject, and supporting it with evidence is often the central aim of argument. Which I think is probably true. This is a vision of argument as expressive rather than persuasive, though, right? So in other words, this is a way of thinking about argument that sees the goal of argument as being the expression of the arguer's point of view or experience or beliefs or perspective, etc. A lot of times, and a lot of arguments have as their goal, by contrast, the production of effects of one sort or another in an audience. And those two things seem like they're kind of in tension. So I'd be interested to hear about how you see that tension between persuasion and expression as potentially competing goals of argument. So kind of jumping forward a little bit, and just kind of keeping in mind, it'll be really important to tie all the things together. So for instance, when you say information overload bores the listener and serves no purpose in persuading the audience, here we're kind of back in the realm of the goal of argument is, in fact, to persuade, not just to express. And so that's what a good instance of how you're at different moments saying different things about the goal of argument that you need to find a way to bring into harmony as we move forward. It seems like reading your description of bad argument, what's mostly at stake is a combination of illogicality. I see that in your substantive focus on fallacies, and kind of what we might want to call bad ethos, bashing the negative side, unreliable audience. In other words, things that make the arguer seem unreliable or untrustworthy. So I'd be interested to hear more then again about how this works as we go forward in digital contexts. So and I'm especially interested in you kind of come to at the end this notion that bad arguments can actually have some utility. So given that a lot of the stuff that you're saying is really important for good argument is just not how people do make many, many arguments in digital contexts, can good argument happen in digital contexts? And then in a similar vein, if bad argument is helpful and useful, does that make it good? Are there forms of bad argument that are in their way also good argument? If so, how do you put all that together inside of the overarching theory? And if not, why not? Why would we say some bad arguments are useful but still bad? How can we make that distinction? And to be clear, I'm not saying we can't make it. I just want to see it more fully elaborated if that's the position you end up taking. So then back here, when we're talking about these different aspects of good argument as essentially things that you look for both in your own argument and in looking at your opponent's arguments, we're kind of here back in this dialogic, two people talking way of thinking about argument, which is fine, and that describes a lot of the arguments we do in fact have in life. But thinking about digital contexts, a lot of the arguments we have are really multilateral. They're hypermediated. That is to say, they arrive to us through multiple media forms. So one argument, for instance, a political speech might be offered to a room full of reporters and supporters, mostly reporters and supporters, and then broadcast on television, and then have a clip or the entirety of the speech retransmitted, remediated in a major news outlet like the New York Times, the Washington Post, or whatever, and then remediated one more time in an article about that speech that draws on primarily its first site of major news coverage, and then remediated one or more times when it reaches you on your Facebook feed after somebody else has seen a post about it on Reddit. In other words, and that was kind of a long-winded way of saying it, but the point is, in other words, a lot of how argument travels means that in digital contexts, the classic speaker, audience, or opponent one, opponent two ways of thinking about argument tend to get broken down or dispersed in ways that are harder to track. And so I'm looking forward to seeing as you move into that next assignment, how you think about what that means for what you ought to be looking for or doing in your own arguments, and what you want from, or how you would criticize other people's arguments, especially people who might not be your opponent per se, but whose arguments you still find yourself wanting to assess and evaluate. So I hope these reflections are useful as you move forward, and I strongly encourage you, of course, to reach out, make an appointment to meet with me, or come see me in office hours, and I look forward to reading you and talking with you going forward. Thanks, and bye.